Hello and welcome to Subject to Change with me, Russell Hogg. My guest today is Dr. Zareer Masani. Zareer is an historian, biographer and broadcaster. He is particularly well known for his biographies of Macaulay and Indira Gandhi, and he also wrote a very moving memoir about his parents. Welcome, Zareer, to the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Russell.
What we agreed to talk about today, our main subject is Robert Clive, or Clive of India, as he's best known in the UK. And I thought that we should do the opposite of what Humpty Dumpty advises. Let's start at the end. So could you just describe Clive's last hours, and then maybe we can go back to his career and try to place him in Indian history more generally?
Well, his last hours were rather gruesome and rather tragic because he suffered from what we would now recognize as bipolar depression, which in those days no one recognized. And so he had these phases of acute depression followed by euphoria. He was in London in his house in Berkeley Square, having dinner with his wife and some guests. And he was experiencing a panic attack and also severe abdominal pains, which went with his psychiatric condition. And he withdrew from the dining table and went into his rooms and just disappeared. And his wife went looking for him half an hour later and found him sitting on a water closet, having slit his throat with a penknife. So he was, caught in this kind of, terrible sort of frenzy of abdominal pain and mental pain, and just committed suicide. Then there were all kinds of apocryphal stories about how he must have been an opium addict and taken an overdose of opium, etc. None of that. There's no evidence for any of that. He did take opiates for his abdominal pains from time to time, which was very common. People in the 18th century and 19th century used opium quite commonly for pain and medical conditions.
And you say he committed suicide at his house in Berkeley Square. So he must have been an enormously wealthy man by this stage. He must have been a considerable figure in society by the time he died.
Well, I don't think Berkeley Square then was as expensive or elite as it is now. I think in the 18th century, you had to be fairly well off, which he was. His Indian fortune was the equivalent of what today would be 20 million pounds. Now, this was not a huge sum, certainly not a huge sum by Indian standards, wasn't a huge sum even by today's standards. Enough to buy him a house in Berkeley Square, and he had a couple of country estates, and he needed his money to finance his British political career, because Parliament was very much somewhere you bought your way into through rotten and pocket boroughs, etc., in the 18th century. And Clive had political ambitions, so he used his money quite lavishly to finance a group of about 10 MPs at their maximum. And he was also very generous to friends, and he was very charitable. He gave a huge amount to indigent soldiers' charities with the East India Company. So he was not a particularly greedy man when it came to how he spent his money.
We'll maybe come on to how he acquired such money as he had. But let's go back and try and put it into context. And sort of the first bit of context I wanted to try and create for the listeners was very much a sort of a high-level view of Indian history, perhaps down from, the age of Alexander down to the arrival of the first Europeans. So what's that? It's about 1,500, maybe even 2,000 years, I guess. But can you just give a very rough sketch of what's been going on during that period?
Since Alexander.
Well, you can take it from when you like.
If you want to start with Alexander, I suppose India was divided into several kingdoms. Out of those emerged around the time of Alexander the Mauryan Empire, which was forgotten for 2,000 years till it was rediscovered by British Orientalists who actually deciphered its script, excavated its monuments. So there was this Mauryan Empire which united the subcontinent for what was a fairly brief period in its history. They disappeared. Then there were various foreign invasions from Central Asia, etc. Then you got another sort of semi-empire in the central Indian area, what was called the Indo-Gangetic Plain around the Ganges, which never became an all-India empire. It was mainly a North Indian empire called the Gupta Empire. And then again, you got lots of warring kingdoms. And then you got Muslim invasions from Afghanistan downwards and Central Asia. So there were several Muslim dynasties who established themselves in Delhi and ruled a large part of India. And the Mughals came in about the early 16th century. The Mughals came from Central Asia. They were descended from the Mongols, but they had intermarried with the Turks, so they were an Islamic family. And they came by Afghanistan, and the first Mughal emperor was Babur, who was really an Afghan who didn't particularly like India, but nevertheless he conquered it and decided to stay.
And had they conquered the whole of the subcontinent or just the north?
No, initially it was just the north. It expanded gradually southwards. So, if it started in the early 16th century up north, by the end of the 16th century, it had reached the Deccan, which was in the center of India. And then towards the end of the Mughal Empire in the 17th century, it actually reached further down south, but never the whole of India. It was predominantly northern based.
And what I don't quite understand is the Portuguese, I think, they arrive, is it 1500 they arrive, or a little before, a little after?
A little before, I think, yes.
And so who's in charge when they arrive? I mean, they're on the west coast, I guess, mainly.
Yes. Well, the Portuguese only had a couple of enclaves on the west coast. So the Mughals were initially it was the Delhi Sultanate of the dynasty before the Mughals, who were a Muslim dynasty, and then the Mughals came in the early 16th century. So around the time that the Portuguese would have been establishing their colonies.
So the Portuguese, they're just sort of pinpricks on the map of India, effectively.
Yes. I don't think they were ever a serious contender for occupying the whole subcontinent or anything like that.
And so then after that, we've got the Europeans start to turn up. So we've got the French, we've got the Dutch, we've got the English. So can you just say a little bit about these, I don't know what you would call them, these arrivals, these incursions, and why are they there? What's their motivation for being there?
Well, their main motivation is trade, because India was rich in spices and textiles and silks and precious stones. So they were there primarily as traders, and their colonies tended to be on the east and west coasts. And the Dutch, again, like the Portuguese, only had a couple of small settlements. Their main aim was further in Southeast Asia, in the area of Indonesia, etc. The main contenders against the British were the French, who the French East India Company arrived at more or less the same time as the British. And as England and France increasingly competed in Europe and eventually became the main competitors for global superpower status, they were fighting proxy battles in India through alliances they had with Indian rulers. So both the French and the British backed rival rulers and competed through that.
But my understanding was that the English were pretty feeble, at least at first, with the East India Company. It wasn't a particularly impressive endeavor in the early years. And is that your impression also?
Yes, it wasn't particularly interested in territorial power. It just wanted to keep its trading settlements in Madras and Calcutta, and then later Bombay. And it became increasingly militarized by having to defend those settlements from either local rulers or pirates or the French. So that escalated, and they then started recruiting their own private army with Indian sepoys. And then there were British royal troops sent out as well when things escalated with the French. The French sent out their regular troops, the British sent out theirs. So the military aspect escalated through the early 18th century. Also, exacerbated by the collapse of the Mughal Empire, because the Mughal Empire had kept a certain kind of peace in the subcontinent that had disintegrated by the 1730s.
Why did the Mughals become weak like this? Is this just the nature of empires, or
It was a combination of things. One of the reasons was they had possibly overextended by going too far south. Secondly, they had no primogeniture, so every time there was a succession, all the brothers fought and killed each other and their nephews and whatever. So that was a major problem, which was the same in Turkey, actually. I think also there were major invasions from Afghanistan and Iran. So the Shah of Iran invaded in the 1730s, and he sacked Delhi and reduced the Mughal emperor to, a non-entity, plundered the capital, killed hundreds of thousands of people. So that was the major blow to the Mughals. Then came the kings of Afghanistan in the later decades, who followed much the same process. They came, they plundered, they left. They weren't interested in territorial power. So the Mughals really by then were quite ineffective.
I seem to remember reading somewhere about enemies from the south, and I'm going to get the name terribly wrong, but the
Yes,
Marathas.
the Marathas, are the regional entity who are around what is now the city of Bombay, which they renamed Mumbai, and it is their kind of regional capital of the state of Maharashtra. They rose in the middle of the 17th century, partly as a reaction to Mughal control, and launched various kinds of guerrilla wars against the Mughals. But then by the 18th century, they'd become a major landed power themselves. And they brought huge armies to Delhi and reduced the Mughal emperor to a puppet. They did fight the Afghans, and they lost to the Afghans. So there was all this kind of total some people call it the anarchy. It wasn't anarchy in the sense of no government. There were regional governments, but a huge amount of regional warfare.
And the Mughals were simply unable to resist by the end, I guess.
Yes, I mean, they really were reduced to complete sort of impotence as far as any kind of central power went. They controlled the area of Delhi in the end, which became a very rundown area once it had been plundered and looted. And they stayed there till the mutiny in 1857, when the British, they were temporarily taken over as the figurehead of the mutiny by the East India Company's sepoys, some of them, not all, a small minority actually. But the Mughals were made a figurehead for that rebellion.
It does seem like one of the main roles of the Mughals by the time when the British were becoming dominant in Bengal was to provide sort of a legitimate, a stamp of legitimacy on whoever was actually in charge.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the British certainly liked to have their kind of seal of approval, but and used pensioned them off, and basically were quite benign to them. But by 1857, when the mutiny happened, they really had lost all patience with the remnants of the Mughal emperors in Delhi.
I think you hinted earlier on that a very significant event in the history of the British in India was actually their battles with the French. And this sort of moved them from being traders to having to be something more significant. So can you say a little bit about the conflict there and what that then led on to? And I don't know if Clive is in the story yet.
Well, yes, I think we can bring Clive into the story quite early because the East India Company, by the mid 18th century or by the 1740s, had got locked into a proxy war with the French East India Company in the south of India between the British settlement at Madras and the French settlement at Pondicherry. And the French armies were led by a very able general, the Marquis Dupleix, who eventually ended up being the main kind of general competing with Clive. Now, what's quite interesting is that Clive arrived in Madras as clerk, really, not a soldier. He got pretty fed up with being a clerk and decided that he had military talent. So he was completely self taught. He had no military training, but he volunteered to initially lead a platoon, and it grew from there because he was very enterprising, very brave, and nothing deterred him.
Can I just ask about this? Because you said earlier that the company has its own army, which is primarily sepoys, though I guess it would have English officers. But then there are also royal troops. So what part of this military force is Clive leading? Is he leading the company forces?
Yes, he was at that stage involved with leading the company forces, and he, from a very junior sort of level, leading a platoon, he rose to becoming a general. Not in any formal, I mean, they didn't have very formal ranks, but he led quite large armies. But they were very small armies by Indian standards. And what made them very effective was that they were extremely well trained, well armed, and the officers and the sepoys had a very close link. I mean, they shared each other's living conditions, they shared their dangers and their hardships. So Clive was very popular with his Indian sepoys, and he led them against the French and very large armies of the French, the local potentate whom the French were in alliance with. And he carried out all sorts of rather daring tactics whereby he forded rivers that were considered unfordable. He managed to enter people's forts when they had gone somewhere else to besiege someone else, and he withstood major sieges. So this was all in what were called the Carnatic Wars, which were in South India. Now,
And no, sorry, go on.
the next phase of his career, he then came back to England, and for a year.
Can I just interrupt there? Why does he come back to England? Is it that he's fed up with India, or
No,
is his period of service at an end, or how does it work?
what it is that his health was suffering by that stage. For British officers in India, life was very hard, great heat, a lot of infections they had no immunities to, so they didn't keep well. He married an English woman who had come out to Madras. They decided to come back to London and for him to have a British political career. Came back to London, nothing worked out for him politically here. Focusing more on his Indian career, he came back because things weren't working out for him in London. Again, the Carnatic Wars were still going on, so Madras was very happy to have him back. He came back as deputy governor of Madras and commanded their armies again very successfully. And then there was a crisis in Bengal, which was the most prosperous area which the company traded in. And the company had its fort at Calcutta, which was a great center of commerce and trade, attracted a lot of Indian merchants and bankers and so on. It attracted the wrath of the Nawab of Bengal, who was initially the deputy of the Mughal emperor, who had virtually become an independent ruler in his own right. He made various financial demands on the company, which the company then refused. He then invaded its port of Calcutta, and there was this atrocity of the Black Hole of Calcutta, where 100 or so British men, women, and children were locked into an airless room overnight, and half of them were dead by the morning. And the Nawab is meant to have been responsible for this, not deliberately, but simply by neglect, didn't bother to find out what was going on and where they'd been put. So he was known for being a pretty brutal and cruel ruler. And so Clive was sent up north to Bengal from Madras with an armed force to basically push the Nawab back from Calcutta, which he did.
How can he manage to do this with such a tiny army? And presumably the Nawab is able to field something pretty impressive, right?
The thing with Indian armies they were huge, say 100,000, but that also involved having a baggage train and cattle of another 100,000 around them to feed them, because they didn't have, railway lines in those days to kind of feed the troops, etc. So they had to carry all their food with them. So it made a very unwieldy force. Now, Clive's was a much more small and effective force. Initially, he didn't, the Nawab withdrew from Calcutta by the time Clive arrived. Clive then entered into a plot with the Nawab's own bankers and nobles who wanted to get rid of him because they'd had enough of him. He wasn't liked really by anyone much, and especially the Hindu business class, whom he depended on for funding and had loans from but hadn't repaid, really had enough of him. So the plot was led by his own uncle, who basically signed a contract with Clive to get rid of him. The rival armies met at the Battle of Plassey, which was a very half-hearted battle, because by then a good half of the Nawab's army, led by his uncle, just stood aside and waited to see who was going to come out on top. And Clive came out on top, and they then swung over and joined Clive. And the Nawab then became a fugitive. His uncle then had him killed, not Clive, although Clive was later blamed for it. He had nothing to do with the execution or murder of the Nawab. And his uncle was made the new Nawab.
But just before we go on with this, you said the Hindu bankers were unhappy with the old Nawab. And can you just say a bit about how because the Mughal Empire is Islamic. So how does this Hindu and Islamic world fit together at this stage? And is there a particular reason why the bankers are Hindu? Is it because Islamic people are not happy with lending at interest, or what's going on there?
Yeah, I think you put your finger on it. Islam doesn't allow banking in that sense, or didn't in those days. And so you got these Hindu business castes, the Marwaris and the Banyas, who migrated from Rajasthan to different parts of India to carry out these banking operations and set up banking houses. So they were, and then there were also Punjabi Hindus who came and joined in that sort of process.
So how much of India is Hindu and how much of it is Muslim at that stage?
I suppose the proportions would have been much the same as they were at independence, which was, 3/4 Hindu and a quarter Muslim.
Right.
The Muslims tended to be either imports who were really foreigners from Central Asia and the Arab world, didn't speak any Indian languages, kept completely aloof and had their own kinship networks and married within their own families. Or they would be converts from Hinduism, some of whom would be nobility. Others would just be converts from the Hindu untouchable caste who preferred the egalitarian aspects of Islam.
Sorry, I sort of drove us off into a side road there, but I was quite interested by that. So the old Nawab is gone. Clive has signed a contract with the new man, and presumably he signed a contract in exchange for what?
The plot was to remove the Nawab and replace him with a friendly Nawab. And the new Nawab, basically granted the East India Company all its rights, former rights in Calcutta, and said there would be no further demands made on it. He also offered Clive quite a large amount of war booty and said, my whole treasury is at your disposal. So Clive later said he marveled at his own moderation because he could have taken 10 times the amount he actually took. So he took, as I said, the equivalent of now what would be 20 million pounds. It was a period then of considerable sort of license and corruption among the company's own officers, because they took advantage of the new situation to start trading privately. Although the East India Company officially had a monopoly, its clerks and officials started carrying on their own private trade. And its clerks and officials started carrying on their own private trade. And they took advantage of the fact that the company now had more or less a puppet Nawab to ignore all the local customs and duties and claim exemption from them, which hit the Nawab's treasury very hard because he couldn't levy taxes on their trade. So there was this period of rampant corruption, which Clive is blamed for, because for those 2 years he became governor of Bengal.
But what could he do about it in practice? Because he's only one man, right?
Yes, and the whole system wasn't geared to the company ruling. So it was a completely sort of transitional period, where everything was in flux. So whoever wanted to took advantage of this to trade. And they would trade through Indian agents, but it was a very monopolistic kind of private trade from which both the company lost and the Nawab's treasury lost.
And so the trade presumably is still money is flowing into India in exchange for whatever it is, cloth or whatever, to be exported back to England.
Oh, yes, yes. I mean, the company was still bringing bullion in to buy the goods it had then exported back to Britain, which was its main trade. It didn't have at that stage, there were very few goods that India wanted to buy from Britain.
Yes, quite so. Okay, so at this stage, I think at this stage, Clive, he goes back to England, right, for a second time?
Yes, so after those 2 years, he goes back to England again. It's partly to do with his health. He has this constant bipolar problem of extreme depressions, which affect him physically as well. So, and his wife, there were various pregnancies, etc.
Is his wife came back out to India with him?
Yes, I think so, yes.
Goodness. Okay, that's interesting. Well, she must have done if there were various pregnancies.
Yeah.
It stands to reason.
She certainly came out for his second governorship because Clive then returns to Britain for a couple of years and again pursues his British political career, which was always his main objective. He was not particularly that keen to become Viceroy of India or anything like that. He wanted to become a member of the British cabinet, and he had ambitions possibly in becoming a prime minister.
And can I just stop you there? What is Clive's social position in Britain as a young man? What's his family? Are they middle class? What's his background?
Well, Clive came from a very modest lower gentry family who were not particularly, they were quite badly off. He had a very basic education in the local village school, etc., and then was articled to the company as a clerk at the age of 15, so that he could get some kind of support and income. So the family were very modest, which is why he faced quite a lot of prejudice from the old British ruling class, the Whig aristocracy, who very much dominated the political scene at the time. And they looked down on him as a bit of an upstart, someone who'd made his own money rather than inherited it. It was considered, just as you didn't buy furniture, you inherited it. You didn't earn money yourself, it was inherited by you. So Clive was very much considered a nouveau riche upstart in that sense. So he faced that prejudice all his life, really.
So he's back in London in his second phase, and he's trying to sort of pursue some sort of a political career, but up against it because the establishment is not particularly welcoming of a man such as that. So how long is he back in England for before he heads back out to India?
Again, a couple of years go by. He is quite active within the East India Company. He buys a lot of East India stock, so he's become a major shareholder. And he was one of the criticisms was that he speculated with company stock and bought and sold, insider trading, as it were. So that went on. And then there was a crisis in India because there was a famine a couple of years after he left, for which he's blamed now, the 1770 famine. But he'd been back in England for 2 years when it happened. It was very much to do with cyclical famines that Bengal used to have, with monsoon failures, etc. There's no evidence they would have been better handled by the Nawab than by the East India Company. So that happened. Then there was a falling out between the company and the new Nawab, who joined up with the fugitive Mughal emperor and the Nawab of the neighboring kingdom. And the three of them launched an invasion of Bengal, which the East India Company defeated at what was called the Battle of Buxar. So Clive was back in England when all this was happening, but the company decided they really needed him back in Bengal to settle things after these opponents had been defeated. So he arrived again in Bengal after the Battle of Buxar. The Mughal emperor, who was then a fugitive, arrived at his camp and asked for asylum, which Clive gave him, and very generously gave him one of the most prosperous districts of Bengal as a private estate and a regular pension to maintain him in the style to which he was accustomed. So Shah Alam II, who was the Mughal emperor, then went off as a British pensioner. And Clive, in return for that, he granted Clive what was called the Diwani of Bengal, which was the financial ministership of Bengal, which normally would have been in the gift of the Nawab, but the Mughal emperor gave it to the East India Company to basically collect the revenue in return for the pension they were giving him. So the revenues of Bengal after that came to the East India Company, which used them then to buy its goods for export. It no longer needed to bring bullion from Britain. It had an Indian income from its revenue.
So this is a huge net loss to the Indian economy then?
Well, it's not, because
well, it is, because the taxes would have stayed, isn't it? It feels like it is. There's goods have come out. The English haven't paid for them. The Indians have paid for the goods through their taxes. So surely this is a loss to the Indians.
Well, the revenue was being used to buy the goods, which were still fueling the Indian economy. I mean, the East India Company was a major buyer of, manufactured textiles and other goods by artisans in Bengal. So they were still getting their orders. The company, instead of bringing the bullion from Britain, was using the revenue. But it was coming back in the sense that the taxes were being spent in India. And yeah.
Okay, so at this stage, the English have they've taken over now, haven't they?
Well, only half, because still the Nawab was there as a kind of, very reduced, but there were functions which the Nawab and his officials performed, not very independently any longer. But the company had become the major territorial power, and that was recognized by Clive in that he had already announced before he came back to India that he was going to cleanse the Augean stables, and that he was going to ban private trade. He was going to stamp out corruption. And so the poacher turned gamekeeper. And his second administration of Bengal was very much a crackdown on the private trade by company officials. He gave them a monopoly in salt, but he banned them from trading in any other goods. So the Bengal economy benefited from that because their monopolistic practices came to an end. He refused all gifts himself. He introduced a rule that no company officer could accept a gift. So it was pretty much a kind of, cleansing of the corruption and putting the administration on a sounder footing. Again, he was only back for about 2 years. So The reformed administration was later taken over by his successor, Warren Hastings, who had a much longer term as Governor General, and basically built on those reforms and created a much more permanent civil service, etc.
Just to sort of look back a little bit, do you think, and this is sort of one of these hopeless questions because it's a counterfactual and nobody can really answer them, but was the English success to some extent inevitable because the English had better finance, better weapons, they had a navy which the French couldn't match? You know, were the English bound to be successful in the end, or was it, you know, good fortune, bad judgment by their enemies, and, you know, the capability of, you know, exceptional men like Clive, do you think?
Yes, I've just been in the process of about to review this economic history of India, 1707 to 1857, by Tirthankar Roy, who is the leading Indian economic historian based at the LSE. And his thesis very much is that the reason the company came out on top was that it was able to promote various kinds of mercantile and banking connections, which none of the other Indian regional powers were able to do. It had, first of all, it had its seaboard connections, which were very important to trade. Secondly, it had these ports or port cities already, which were havens of enterprise and business. It introduced joint stock companies for Indian merchants. And it started Indo European partnerships between British and Indian merchants to supply the seaports from inland trade. So it linked up trade routes across India. And this was quite, revolutionary for its time because nothing like that existed in the 18th century or before. East India Company was the first power to do it. So the rising merchant classes in India had a huge incentive for this to continue and really were investing in the company through loans, which they expected would be repaid. With Indian rulers, they could never rely on loans being repaid. So the company was a much better bet for banking houses, merchants, industrial manufacturers on a small scale, and so on.
So then Clive, he's there only for 2 years, and then I think Hastings takes over, who I think is quite well regarded, Hastings, although he faced some pretty determined opposition while he was in India. But I think now he has quite a good reputation, doesn't he?
Yes, unlike Clive, who is still demonized as having been a pirate and plundered and looted, etc. Hastings has a good reputation, although Hastings had to face a 7-year impeachment thanks to Edmund Burke. He was exonerated at the end, but it took 7 years of his life.
And Hastings, what's his fate in the end? Does he come back to England? Does he stay in India? What happens to Hastings?
Well, in those days, 90% of people who could came back to England. India was not somewhere you chose to settle, nor did the East India Company encourage settlement. The idea was that European settlers would upset the indigenous population and should be kept to a minimum as much as trade required. So Hastings did come back to London and face this impeachment. Again, had hoped to be given a peerage and possibly have a political career, but was hounded by Edmund Burke and eventually exonerated, but had quite a hard time when he came back.
So Clive's reputation, you sort of say that he has the reputation of the man who, I guess, went around breaking things. He has the reputation of being the plunderer and the pirate. But I sense that your own estimation of him is not that. So well, two questions, I guess. How is Clive regarded in India today, if he's even thought of at all? And and how is he regarded generally?
Well, in India, Clive is regarded very negatively as having, imposed British colonial rule, or at least laid the foundations of it. although it wasn't formally the British government, it was the East India Company, and it was only the administration of Bengal for which he was responsible. So in India, he's basically seen as someone who was very much a colonialist, but because India has a very chauvinistic attitude, or has developed that, especially over the last couple of decades. You have this Hindu nationalism, which is very much more extreme than the earlier secular nationalism, which also would have disliked Clive, but now he's much more demonized, but possibly less so than in Britain, because although he's seen as an enemy of the Indian people, he's seen as having done quite a good job for Britain. Whereas in Britain, he's seen very much as someone who let the side down and who was very greedy and plundered and looted. And you have the wonderful Clive collection at Powys Castle in Wales, which was collected by Clive and his son, who was the second Lord Clive, who came out to India as governor of Madras in the early 19th century. And between them and Clive's daughter-in-law, who was also a great collector, Lady Clive, when her husband was governor of Madras, they collected a wonderful collection of Indo-Anglian art and weaponry, etc., which is quite unique. I mean, it shows the Indo-British encounter, and it is in a very artistic setting, which has been designed and created in the 1980s with a lot of expenditure, etc. But it's dismissed as loot by the anti-Clive brigade. What they don't recognize is that firstly, Clive was quite tasteful in collecting these things. And when you look at them, they're quite discriminating. He didn't just pick up anything. Secondly, they wouldn't exist if he and his son hadn't collected them, because in India there was no tradition of collecting. Antiquities were not valued. They were only later valued because the British valued them. So now Indians value them. They didn't then. There were no museums. So these things would have just been melted down if they were precious metals or discarded. So there is a lot of kind of, I hesitate to use the word woke, but I think there is something woke about the idea that you can't look at the Clive collection except as seeing it as plunder. What people also don't recognize is that what we call plunder today was a perfectly legal form of war booty. It was a part of paying troops and generals in lieu of giving them wages. So everyone expected if they won a battle, there would be booty. So there was nothing unusual about that.
So it's a bit like the naval battles where if you capture the enemy ship and it's sold off, all the people who took part in the battle to capture it, they get their share, right?
Yes, so the common soldiers got their share. The generals like Clive got their share. As Clive said, he was taken to the Bengal Nawab's treasury and said, "Take what you like," and it was piled up to the roof with gold and precious stones. And he just took a very small amount.
I'm sure, well, I'm sure the Nawab, had he been entirely left his own devices, might have.
Well, this was the new Nawab who said, "Come and take what you like. My treasury is yours."
Yes, I know, but I just can't help feeling that the fact that Clive had the victorious army at his back wasn't completely out of sight of the new Nawab's mind.
Yeah.
Okay, well, so and this collection is in Powys Castle, do you say?
Yes, Powys Castle in Wales was the seat of the Earls of Powys and still is, but although it's now been given to the National Trust. Clive's son married the daughter of the former Earl of Powys, who died without any male heirs. So the government, it is sometimes said, feeling guilty about how badly they treated Clive, gave his son and daughter-in-law the right to inherit the titles. So his son became Earl of Powys, and his daughter, through his wife, who was the Countess of Powys, through her father. Poor Clive only got an Irish barony, which was, there was some village in Ireland which was named Plassey, and he was called Baron Clive of Plassey. And he had no right to sit in the British House of Lords, only in the Irish House of Lords. So it didn't, he was very disappointed because it affected his British political career, obviously. And he never lived to obviously see his son inheriting the title he would have loved to have. I mean, Clive would have loved to be Earl of Powys and be a magnate sitting in the British House of Lords.
Yet it's an extraordinary career for a British man at that time, because I suppose, being in India at that time allowed him a degree of freedom that he could have had just about nowhere else.
Fortunes were made in those days if you were really enterprising and had the abilities. Especially, I mean, you could go to the New World and make your fortune in Canada or what were then the American colonies. You could also go east. You could go to Southern Africa. So easier to make your fortune in those places than in Britain.
I don't know if you've ever been to it. Have you been to the Soane Museum in Lincoln's Inn?
No, no, I haven't. No.
It's a very interesting story because Soane is the son of a bricklayer, and somebody just notices his drawings. And must be about 1760, 1770, something like that. And somebody notices his drawings and thinks they're rather good. And so he becomes an apprentice to the architect. And then the architect sends him off to the school, and he wins the gold medal. And he's sent around Europe on the grand tour.
Mm.
And then, so he's now a pretty distinguished architect. And then he marries an heiress whose father promptly dies. So now he's a very talented architect and enormously wealthy. And he spends, he creates a number of, very significant buildings, including the new Bank of England, which unfortunately got lost in the Blitz, I think, or maybe they tore it apart anyway. But anyway, very significant architect, and actually the design of the London telephone box is based on his
Yes.
design. But this is extraordinary that this humble man suddenly becomes this big creature who's able to buy, works of art which the British Museum of the time can't afford. And so there is some mobility in British society.
Yes, no, I'm sure there were exceptions to all these general rules, and I think although the aristocracy were quite powerful, there was quite always room for the rising commercial interests and people, as you say, like Soane coming through. I have come across his name. I haven't been to the museum. I will look out. You said it's in Lincoln's Inn Fields.
I think it's in. I'm trying to remember. I may have the name of that wrong. It's very close to Holborn Tube Station, and it is a must-see if you have not been there. Particularly to go into the room where he kept all his paintings, which is a wonder for the ages. Is all I will say. But if you go there, and you think that there are room for about 30 pictures in the room, but you are wrong. There's room for about 100 or 200 pictures in the room due to the clever mechanisms that he used. So well worth a look.
I will look into that.
Now, have we treated Clive fairly? Have we finished, or is there anything that we've missed that we should mention?
I'm just thinking, I don't think so. I think what I would say now, I would like to take one of the allegations that you hear from people like William Dalrymple,
Yep.
which is that Clive was a sociopath. Now, firstly, no one called anyone a sociopath in the 18th century. The category didn't exist. It's something we now use as a psychiatric category or a criminal category. I think it's grossly inappropriate for someone like Clive because there's absolutely no suggestion that he disliked society, that he disliked the people whom he had any contact with. He was a wonderful family man. He was a very devoted husband. He womanized quite a bit before his marriage, but after marrying, forget her first name. Anyway, after marrying his wife, he did not stray at all was Margaret. Margaret. So after marrying Margaret, he basically was a very devoted husband. He was a devoted father. He had several children, and he, played with them and loved them and was a wonderful father, even by our standards today, let alone the 18th century, and was a very good friend. And, all his close friends really relied on him. He helped them out financially. He was very charitable to the retired soldiers of the East India Company, the equivalent of the Chelsea pensioners today, the wounded and indigent retired soldiers who were housed by the East India Company in their homes. Clive gave a huge amount. He had a legacy from the new Nawab of Bengal when he died. He left Clive in his will. So he clearly wanted Clive to have it, a legacy of what would now be the equivalent of £2 million. Clive, by that time, had this rule that no one was going to accept gifts. So he donated it to the East India Company's charitable homes for indigent soldiers. Gave quite a lot to charity. So I think this accusation of sociopath is just total nonsense.
When it came to his battles, was he cruel to the prisoners that they took, or did he, allow his troops to sort of rape and pillage? What was?
No, there is absolutely no evidence that Clive either killed or tortured or mistreated any of the troops he was fighting against, or that he allowed his own troops to do that. There's absolutely no evidence that they plundered and looted. And the only, as I said, war booty would have been taken, but no one was actually brutalized in the process. And the main casualty of his Bengal battles was the former Nawab Siraj-ud-Dowlah, who had committed the Black Hole atrocity, etc., who was murdered by his own uncle. And, now you have people saying, oh, Clive had the Nawab killed. It's just not so. It was his uncle who had him killed. Clive gave no such instructions.
But even if he had given such an instruction, well, it's pointless to say it because you're making the point that he didn't. But this is not the act of a bloodthirsty maniac. This is just the act of war that goes on in politics of the time. But though I don't really want to pursue the line because if he didn't do it, it's rather pointless in doing so. Dalrymple must have his reasons. He must, or maybe he's just using the term to say, that he did something that in the long run had very bad effects on India. But that seems a bit simple.
No, I don't think William is arguing that. I think all he was doing was writing quite a successful, rather novelistic book about the East India Company's takeover in Bengal. He needed a villain for it, and he decided to make Clive the villain instead of the Nawab Siraj, which goes down much better with Indians, so that it was the wicked Brit who did it. William has said to me privately that Clive is the villain of my book. To which I said, but do historical works need villains? Nothing is that simple, surely.
Maybe narrative history needs villains. I better cut this bit out if he said it to you privately. I don't want to embarrass him.
He didn't ask for it not to be quoted, and I have quoted him on this in other contexts, so you're welcome to use it. He makes no bones about the fact that Clive is the villain of his book, which is not the approach a historian would take. But William writes extremely well, and he writes very commercial books.
He writes beautifully, and it is difficult writing history like this because there's so many people and it's so confusing. The names to British ears are very confusing. You have, everybody's got a million relatives and you've got parties where, your readers are not familiar at all and you're trying to keep them all together. So I suppose trying to get a clear narrative line must be quite tempting if you're writing a history.
No, in some respects, his book is quite balanced in that he does acknowledge that the banking and merchant classes were investing in the East India Company, which had the loans, which is why it won the wars. It had the financial backing of Indians. So he accepts all that, and he accepts that there was a plot by the business elites in Bengal to remove Siraj and replace him, and Clive, plugged into that. So he, in that respect, he's quite balanced. I think it's also that it depends on how commercial you want to make a book. If you want to make it a fairly black and white kind of who won and who should have won, and I suppose the question is, if you were to have all the kind of saving clauses about Clive, but on the one hand this, on the one hand that, you wouldn't sell as many books.
Having said that, I've read the Anarchy. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I didn't come away from it thinking that Clive was this dyed-in-the-wool villain. He may have used the word sociopath, but I didn't feel when he was describing the events that, as you say, there was no evidence presented to show Clive behaving in a sociopathic fashion. So it may be that that's a line that was used rather than an argument that was really developed in any great depth, at any rate.
No, I don't think there was any evidence of that. I read and reviewed the book for History Today.
I read your review.
Yeah, it's a few years now. I'm trying to remember. I think the main way he approached Clive was he used all the Mughal sources on Clive, which were very negative.
They would be.
Him as this kind of person who had, expropriated the Nawab, etc. And he didn't interrogate those sources in the way that a historian would, to say, well, if so-and-so was the court chronicler of the Nawab or the Mughal emperor, he would say that, wouldn't he? So William was quite critical of British sources to the extent he used them, but not of his Indian sources.
Okay, well, what I need to do is to get William Dalrymple and you on the same podcast so you can set two.
He won't, because I have suggested it on several occasions. Oh, he says, yes, we must organize this. But whenever it happens, he pulls out at the last minute. So we were meant to be on a panel together at the Cliveden Festival next month, middle of this month. And he suddenly pulled out.
Okay, so I think we've done Clive. I think we've done him justice. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Russell. Thanks for having me. Thoroughly enjoyed it. Look forward to hearing it.
Well, that's the end of today's show. I hope you enjoyed listening, and if you did, do please join me for the next episode. And if you have the time, please do recommend me to your friends. And a share on social media and maybe a review on iTunes really helps my guests get the audience they deserve. Goodbye for now.